dark dock. In a penitential prison with a lifelong...
Pestilential.
That's not a word.
That's it. It's not penitential.
Pestilential?
Yeah.
That's definitely not...
It's not penitential.
Is
too
pestilential a word? Like pestilence?
I don't know.
He's not a theater nerd.
Dude, do you see this
Oh, I'll get it.
That's what I'm saying.
Move your drink. No, just move your drink.
He likes something in there.
My drink.
I won't.
He smells you. You're too sweet. Why would you do that?
To get it.
Hello, and welcome back. This is Faith, Reason, and the Things Between, a series on the great works of Western civilization. Today we are looking at Dracula by Bram Stoker. I'm joined today by Mr. Will Murphy and Mrs. Sadie Murphy. We all read the book together, and we will be discussing it in detail. Now, to begin with, quick introduction to Bram Stoker. He was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland. He received both a Bachelor and Master of Arts from Trinity College. He was very interested in theatre and worked as the business manager of a London theatre and as an assistant to a well-known actor of the time. Stoker was a Protestant in the Church of Ireland, a believer in science and progress, and had academic interests in the occult. Dracula was inspired in part by the folklore from Eastern Europe, which he had a lot of exposure to. The book is still highly influential today in film, literature, and many other creative arts. We're going to be going through this and looking at a number of themes. Firstly, the elements of the story related to its structure, style, plot, the characterization of the characters, just what you thought of different plot choices. Obviously, what was scary about it. We can't not talk about that.
It was legitimately scary.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The relationships between characters, the way that they're portrayed, stuff that is literally like, is this well written and why? And like, what was cool about it, right? We're also going to talk a little bit about vampires or Dracula showing or representing various perversions of Christ or Christianity. Opposing that, we have the presence of the sacred and how it's treated. I'll be talking a lot about what this book says about how we come to know things. Will, if you come across anything that you feel like is relevant to the history of film or how this book has influenced various movies?
That's a great question. I forget the exact number because I Googled it before, but there's around 500 different, not adaptations necessarily of Dracula, but Dracula's been portrayed around 500 times on film.
Wow.
So significantly more than any other character.
That's incredible.
The second closest is Sherlock Holmes, I think around 300. And I think if you open that up into plays and audiobooks and things like that, I don't know that really holds up. I don't know if anybody's tracked that number. I bet Sherlock Holmes would be a lot closer, if not more. But it is interesting that they're both Victorian era characters.
Definitely.
Right? I mean, both late Victorian in particular. There's nobody that doesn't know who Dracula is, and there's certainly nobody that doesn't know what a vampire is. And I did absolutely no research into vampires in other cultures throughout history because there's always been something that's eaten blood, basically in every culture. But if you ask anybody in sort of Europe, America, North America, probably even parts of South America, their idea of a vampire will be a Victorian gentleman vampire. It will all come straight down through Dracula. Like Sherlock Holmes, somebody's idea of a detective will all come straight down through Sherlock Holmes, right? Even if your idea is a noir detective, that's just leaning on Sherlock Holmes and his addiction problems. Or if your idea is any other sort of vampire, it's either sleeping in a coffin or not being able to go out in the sun or any sort of thing, and those are all sort of solidified in Dracula.
Sure, absolutely. And then, Sadie, I will be relying on you to talk about the interesting relationships between the sexes in this book, because it comes up a lot, and I'm not sure what I think about it. So, I'll be relying on your perspective for that. Okay, so we're going to just start going through the book, starting with, of course, the first 5 chapters. This is a spoiler warning. We are going in great detail into the plot of the book. So,
before we begin,
yes,
I have a bit.
You have a bit?
I have a bit. So, one of my favorite things about this book that probably a lot of people don't know, because I don't think a lot of people have read this book, is that it's actually a collection of journals and letters. And I've been thinking for a long time about having my own journal. So, seeing as this is going to, the idea was that this was going to be a Halloween release, and my wife and I's anniversary is Halloween. I have brought a present. So happy anniversary, Zach!
Thank you.
So I've gotten everybody here a little something that we could open up on camera.
Very nice.
One of the more interesting things about this is that I asked a couple of people about journals, and my wife told me that she used to write one. And I said, I've never known you to write in a journal. And she said, well, my parents read mine.
Thank you for the lock.
So I got one with the lock.
Lovely.
Thanks for the trauma bomb there.
That way you won't have any crayon in it.
Yeah,
That's
right. You can't share it with
Yeah.
anyone. Thank you.
All right, so the first 5 chapters are Jonathan Harker in Dracula's castle. So, first reactions about, let's start with just his approach to the castle. He's bumping into people who know the place is evil and they're warning him off. At what point, so obviously we all know that he's Dracula, that he's a vampire, but
Right.
I don't know, at one point did you guys think, okay, now this is weird?
I definitely remember going through the beginning of the book and thinking to myself, I get it, right? Like, I know who Dracula is, I know what vampires are. Jonathan is approaching Castle Dracula, and all of the sort of like the simple townsfolk are like, oh, please don't go. And he's like, oh my goodness, they're so sincere, but I must do my business. And it just feels like I wish I didn't know already what I know. And then basically as soon as he got to the castle, all of those feelings disappeared. Because all of a sudden I was interested in the castle, and I was interested in who Dracula was, and I was, sort of Jonathan was slowly realizing he was a prisoner, and it became a lot more of a psychological game than it was just a regular scare fest. He spends this whole time realizing that, you approach the castle, people are telling him not to. He's handed a rosary, which he's, as a good English Protestant, didn't like, but he took it because they were sincere. He goes to the castle, and then there's just all these little details about Dracula. And this is like the moment that I was like, I wish I didn't know this, because I actually am so excited by it being revealed that he doesn't have a reflection, or it being revealed that he never really comes out during the day, and he has no servants in the house.
Right, but he makes it look like they're on for a long time.
For a long time,
Yes,
right?
He was the carriage driver too.
He was
he drives Jonathan to the castle, and then I don't know, drives away, doubles back on foot, and comes out the front door to say, "Well, hello, I'm your host." Yeah, it's eerie.
Yeah, it's super eerie, because it went from like, oh man, I wish, sort of like rolling my eyes, I already know this, to man, I wish I didn't know this, to now I'm really invested. I'm really invested, because I've spent a couple chapters with this one guy who seems really genuine and really smart, and Dracula is imprisoning him, and he's realizing it, and he knows like there's nothing he can do about it. He tries to get a letter out to sort of the gypsies that are working with Dracula, and Dracula gets the letter given back to him. Like the walls are closing in on the main character. And then things get, like, probably one of the scariest moments of the book is that he sees Dracula climb out of his window upside down, right? So not he's climbing down, he's upright, comes out of the window and turns upside down and crawls on all fours downwards.
Right, like a lizard.
Super unnatural. And that, I think for a lot of people, that's like the clinching moment for this book. What was your thought of that?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to... Honestly, the most interesting part of it for me was his historical diatribe about like where his family came from. Yeah, because, well, first of all, it pointed out to me just how little I knew of Eastern European history.
Fair enough.
But after a little bit of research, I realized that is the section where it's more or less proof that it is Vlad the Impaler. You
Right.
know, if you look at the references, he talks about the of the Second Battle of Kosovo. He mentions a brother of his that sold out his people to the Turks. You can look that up. That was true. And then, of course, the mustache. Yeah.
Right, that was a funny thing that Sadie had mentioned to me. She goes, I never, and we'll get back to that, I never imagined Dracula with a mustache. I never imagined him as an old man with a mustache.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. In addition, I thought that the entire episode with the castle was reminiscent of. It spoke to me as if it was an analogy for sin, especially like addictive sins.
Okay.
Like, he comes to the door of the castle, and Dracula says, "Enter freely and of your own will."
Yeah, very
And
clearly.
very clearly, he doesn't beckon. He just stops and waits. And once Jonathan's over the threshold, then come on in. You're welcome here. The doors are all locked, and he says clearly. He's
like, you can do whatever you want, right?
You may go anywhere you wish in the castle, except where the doors are locked, where of course you will not wish to go. There is reason that all things are as they are. And of course, if the doors to leave are locked, yeah, there's a reason. You're trapped here. You're a prisoner. Like, what is initially your will quickly becomes against your will, really.
Right.
Your instincts kind of trap you there. And then in addition to that, at one point he does get the Count to agree to release him, but there's wolves outside. And so he kind of tricks Jonathan into saying, all right, fine, I won't leave, because it's dangerous outside, as it often is to climb out of a habit.
Right. That's true.
Anyways, but besides that, there are a few little bits I want to point out, just keeping with our themes. You kind of talked a little bit about the presence and the importance of the sacred, how the rosary beads that were hung around his neck. He saw that as in some measure idolatrous, but it did have an effect on Dracula. That was a very strange scene.
Yeah, what's the line that you often say, right? It's that everybody makes fun of the Catholics until they need an exorcist.
Yeah.
Right? And so I don't know. I can't imagine the tension growing up in the Church of Ireland in the 1800s.
Sure.
Right? Because you have this historically, and I know that he moved to England and ran the Lyceum Theatre, Bram Stoker. But you have this historically very Catholic country, and then this hostile takeover from England. And now you have families entrenched. I mean, those entrenchments last to today, right? And you can see that in a lot of stories that are born out during the Troubles, which were, only 70 years after this book came out, something like that. 60 years,
20 years, right?
No, you're thinking of the Irish Revolution, right? Yeah, forget about the Troubles. The Ireland gained its freedom from England,
Sure, right.
in 1916, right?
Yeah.
So, so I can't imagine the tension of being in this Protestant church that is required by law, more or less, if you're English, and then being in Ireland, where every other old granny's got a rosary,
Right.
and which he has, and is doing the Catholic thing.
Sure.
Right? So he's given a rosary, he thinks it's idolatrous, but he keeps it anyway, and then it repels essentially the devil. Right? This blessed item repels the devil. I don't know what Bram Stoker's trying to say. I think he's about his religion so much as he's trying to show the reader before we know that Dracula is pure evil.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of pure evil, he's described as demonic a number of times, compared to the devil, described with hellfire in his eyes, of course. But also when he's talking about going to London, he's talking about leaving his home and going to a new place, and he says, I have been so long master that I would be master still, or at least that none other should be master of me. And plus, there's a number of lines where he shows great disdain for the common person, the peasantry, and stuff. And that, to me, sounded exactly the opposite of like Christ coming to Earth.
Oh, interesting.
Like completely willing to humble himself, like spends most of his time amongst the common people. Yeah. But the part that I want to underline quickly before we get too far along, because it's going to develop slowly, is Jonathan trying to make sense of what he's seeing. Because he's not a scientist, but he's a product of his time, the Age of Enlightenment, and the question is, when you're faced as somebody with that way of knowing, and you're faced with something like a vampire, how do you compute that? And basically, he can't eventually, but he starts off one of the chapters by saying, "Let me begin with facts, bare, meager facts, verified by books and figures, and of which there can be no doubt. I must not confuse them with experiences which will have to rest on my own observation or my memory of them." He can't quite understand what he's seeing, and so he's doubting himself,
right?
And trying to fall back. Okay, hold on. Well, at least the numbers and verified empirical facts cannot be falsified. Let me at least go back to that. That's a very modern notion. It comes from Francis Bacon, who's credited with founding the scientific method, at the cost of throwing out most other kinds of knowledge. What we have here is Jonathan coming across.
Right, this does develop throughout the book.
Oh yeah, those other kinds of knowledge. And so how do you compute that once you realize how small a piece of the pie you actually have?
Like superstitious versus
Sure.
scientific.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
when Van Helsing comes in, he kind of is like, well, I understand what's happening to Lucy, but this is all the lore kind of thing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of an interesting question. The baby and the bathwater never seem to be separated, whether you're talking about superstition or spiritual reality, right? So I think you've just blown my mind. I think I've just blamed. Was it the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation kind of go hand in hand there?
That would take a much more sophisticated argument than I'm prepared to do. But in any case, Stoker may be pointing a finger at the limits of the scientific mindset. And saying, okay, science is great, most of the characters are scientists, but there's something else out there. Now, his answer, Stoker's answer, may not be that, it's necessarily what we would say for the spiritual realm. He had a passing interest in the occult. But, he kind of uses Dracula as kind of this way to light a fire under the main character, to say, okay, no, this is real, it's confronting you right now, you have to decide how you're going to respond to it.
Right, because immediately following Jonathan's time in the castle, he is we leave his story.
Yep.
And he is, turns out he was in a hospital, right? Raving mad with brain fever.
Yeah. And
he doesn't feel better until it's told to him that his senses were correct.
Right. Now, of course, we're getting a little bit ahead. But yeah, that is exactly what happens. And there is a quick reference to Hamlet early on.
My tablets.
Your what?
That's what he says.
Oh, yeah, that's right, my tablets. But he also makes a reference to the scene where Hamlet's father, the ghost, appears and then has to depart by sunrise, which is the same scene in which he says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy."
Right,
which is, that's the question, right? Most people before Francis Bacon would have said, yes, there are. Bacon would say, no, there are exactly as many things as can be, acquired by human reason. Whereas a skeptic like Hume or somebody else would say, no, there are fewer, and maybe nothing at all.
Right. I have two quotes written down that really inspired me in the book that sort of go along with this point, and I must apologize that I don't have them on anything but my cell phone because I'm a degenerate. This was actually from Sherlock Holmes, who we were talking about earlier. Sort of later on in the book, when this idea is more fleshed out, it came to my mind that I think maybe in the first Sherlock Holmes story, don't quote me on that, Sherlock Holmes is explaining to Watson his method. And it ends with, when you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's deductive reasoning.
Right.
But Bacon throws out deductive reasoning.
Right. That's my knowledge of Bacon is
Sure.
is basically what you just told me.
Mm.
But certainly this idea that whatever you have in front of you, you can't trust. Right. This whatever's however improbable right in front of you cannot be the truth because this framework doesn't allow it.
Mm.
Which is, I guess that's primarily what you're saying is Bram Stoker is criticizing.
Yeah, and not to the exclusion of science for sure, but he sees the weakness in
Right.
the ideas. But anyways, so Harker and Dracula are not alone in the house. There are other weird lady vampires in here. Their relationship was kind of odd. Sadie, do you have any comments on that? Like, what is...
Well, compared when we're reading this part, we haven't really read Mina and Lucy much, but we see them as like they're very like sexual creatures. Like they're described as like voluptuous and alluring and trying to get him to come in, and he almost accepts a kiss, which would have been his end kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's probably just Stoker's way of like kind of showing like the, you know, later in the book he describes Mina as like basically the perfect woman who's poised and chaste and basically does everything preemptively to help her husband, and then they're like seductive and they're evil, right? It's the difference between good and evil.
And they're traditionally known as the wives of Dracula.
Yes, they are. Yes.
So they're not named that in the book, but that's how the headcanon of history knows them.
Yeah. I think there's like an offhand line, like, no, I know how to love. You guys know.
Right.
Right.
That's true. Yeah.
Right.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
So.
And
so
they're kind of portrayed as that, and that's, I think you kind of call back to it because they come back a little bit at the end, and you kind of can compare the two like tropes of women almost.
Yeah.
Good. I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
Right, because now I imagine that scene with obviously it's very sexual. You already brought up sort of how walking into the castle is analogous to sin, and it's analogous to addictive sin,
Such as lust.
Yeah. But I only saw that from the perspective of Harker.
Mm-hmm.
But now that you've mentioned sort of the flip that you see, or at least how they're the foil to Mina later in the book, there you see them essentially being open to cheating on their husband, if you're going to take them as the wives of Dracula.
Sure.
Which is
Right.
just another layer.
Yeah, but then again, if there's multiple of them...
Eastern Europe, what do you think?
Oh, Jesus. Oh, boy. And Jonathan's kind of like, you know, he's almost wanting them to do it even after he realizes that they're going to bite him.
Yeah.
Like, there's a weird
Well,
kind
he definitely
of
isn't
duel.
fighting, right? He just lays
Right.
there, like he just closes his eyes and waits for it to happen, and then
Yeah.
Dracula ends up saving him, which is like wild.
Right.
And basically it was just because he's such a predator that he was like, "That's not yours," and he just gives them prey in a bag and is to satiate them,
Yeah, right,
basically,
yeah.
and then pushes them off, and that works
Right.
because he's he's overhead of them.
Right. It also introduces this idea in the book that the vampire has sort of a power to entrance.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Which
Right.
is,
Yeah.
if that's not sin, I don't know what is.
No, is that absolutely.
What's that line that Andrew Clavin says, or Matt Fradd? I listened to their interview. They happened to talk about Dracula not that long ago, and they were which is a complete coincidence, and they were talking about Andrew Clavin's writings, and he was like, "Yeah, I write my character like men will throw away their entire lives because there's always cheating in his books, and men will throw away their entire lives for 20 minutes pleasure."
Sure.
Right, and that's sort of the point, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. I think the main way that we can see Dracula as a perversion of Christ is the fact that rather than Christ who gives his blood, Dracula takes it, right?
Right.
Sure.
And, you know, in the way that we understand the church as the bride of Christ, then, you know, and what is that? That's like chaste, unitive, self-giving love. Then, of course, the perversion of it, Dracula drinking blood, has a ton of sexual connotations, lustful connotations all throughout it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, yeah, it's very obvious when the wives of Dracula are descending on Jonathan here, but later on, I feel like it reads like that as well. But we'll
Sure.
get there when we get there, I guess. We end Jonathan's diary for the moment, and we turn to what was happening back in England with Lucy and Mina up through the voyage of the Demeter. So,
Which was my favorite part of the book.
oh yeah.
Like, beyond the shadow of a doubt. The
Mhm.
Voyage of the Demeter was my favorite part of the book.
Yeah. Mina begins by saying, I shall try to do what I see lady journalists do, interviewing and writing descriptions and trying to remember conversations. I am told that with a little patience, one can remember all that goes on or that one hears said during a day. Well, isn't that convenient? Or is it? Do you guys think that people really did have that ability at one point? Or is that just Stoker's device to be able to
Write a
The-
good story.
The ability to write down exactly what happened.
for like a whole day, as the characters do?
I think probably for me to be able to judge that, I would have to live in a world without cell phones.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I think we're just constantly trying to distract ourselves, but back then, especially like I don't think they were even doing it at the end of the day. I think they were doing it as soon as they had downtime instead of scrolling like we would.
Sure.
They open up their book and write down what happened just so that they can better remember it.
Right, they all kept it in, Jonathan kept it in his breast pocket.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Dr.
And I-
Seward dictated it.
And sometimes it was just
Yeah.
letters. Like if something happens during my day, I just text my sister about it. Right?
Yeah.
She just sent a text to Lucy about it. Like
Mhm.
a lot of their correspondence.
Basically.
They're just girls. Like they're just girls like writing letters about their
love
love
lives
lives
and-
and the silliness that's happening during the day and the not so silliness that's happening during the day. And we do the same thing. It's just not it's not to ourselves all the time. It's to other people, but they were just doing it to other people too.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not necessarily at the end of the day. That's helpful because I can't even conceive of that level of.
No, I don't think
attention
it
to
is. I
detail.
think a lot of the time that it'll start with, I had a few minutes before I had this appointment.
That's
I had
true.
to I had to sit down. I'm on the train between this and that, like kind of thing.
I also think there's a big part of like the compartmentalization that we as American people do, right? Like our work is separate from our home, which is separate from our grocery shopping, which is separate. Like I definitely go into different zones. We were just talking about this off camera,
Yeah.
and it's hard to switch between them.
Yeah.
But Lucy, when she's saying that line, is specifically attempting to better her memory and better her journaling so that she can become somewhat of a stenographer for her husband, who's a solicitor, which is the equivalent of a lawyer. And because that was their life.
Yeah.
He was a solicitor all the time. He
Right.
would take a trip out to Eastern Europe, and then he would come back. And she wanted to be able to help him, so she learned other great things about her. She learned the train time, so she could figure out how he could travel best. And it wasn't like he was a solicitor from 9 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock at night. He didn't compartmentalize that. He was a solicitor all the time, and she was his wife, and therefore his stenographer all the time, because they had this. At least that's the way I read it. They had a more.
Well, she learned Mina learned
That-
shorthand and
Right.
all that too to
Yeah.
help. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like shorthand, do you even like? I know one other story where shorthand is a part of the plot. It's
Yeah.
actually a Bob Hope movie,
Okay.
where as an aside, the Nazis, one of the girls that he knows, I think may have been a journalist,
Mhm.
and she accidentally comes into a secret Nazi party in the U.S.
Mhm.
and she writes down everything in her shorthand.
Oh wow.
And they get her and they get her journal and they can't read it, right? But these are the two stories. Like he must have read Dracula before writing that movie, because
Yeah.
I've never heard of another story that uses shorthand because nobody knows shorthand anymore.
Yeah.
Why would we?
Yeah, I know
We
that
wouldn't
it
try to write
exists.
things quickly.
My
Right.
grandmother knew shorthand.
Yeah.
Okay,
Like
so-
my grandma. She was the
I
secretary
know,
at a school. I don't know why
Yeah,
she
there
knew
you
it,
go.
but she used
Yeah.
to write it for me. I'd be like, "What is this language?" You know?
the person I know who
English?
do it was also worked at a school.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
no way.
so
Strange.
random. Yeah, she
Yeah.
was like the assistant to a principal, so it just was
Mhm.
easier for her to write down meetings like that.
Yeah.
It's
That's
crazy.
pretty cool.
But anyways,
Anyways.
the letters and journal entries are going back and forth between these two ladies, Mina, who's the fiancée of Jonathan, who we just met, and Lucy, are about mostly Lucy's love life. Lucy was kind of fawning all over men as a whole, in my view. Is this in any way realistic? It's almost Arthurian. Like, what's up?
I-
do you think?
I think that, I mean, I've heard modern people maybe say that Lucy and Mina are the two different types of women, right? Lucy she has 3 people asking her to marry him, and she's
Yeah.
her, and she's so beautiful on the outside, and she is beautiful inside too, but it's mostly about how beautiful she is on the outside. And Mina is not described as beautiful as her, but she's got one dude. She's doing everything for him basically, and she kissed multiple guys, which back then wasn't really a thing. She kissed a guy after she said no to marrying him, so that
She
wasn't
asked for like a consolation.
right. He
Yeah.
literally, and she said yes, and then cried after telling all of them no because she couldn't say yes to all of them. So she wasn't
Something.
evil, but she was definitely the representation of being not as chaste, and then Mina is the more chaste one, and then Lucy ends up turning, and all those voluptuous things happen to her, and Mina doesn't. So
I hadn't thought of it that way. Do you?
Neither had I.
Yeah.
you're welcome.
Yeah.
We're gonna check your framing and get a refill. Keep going.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks. Do you think that?
Oh yeah, you gotta come in. You're like half out.
Oh, come on.
That's alright. Do you think that
Thanks,
back
I'm here.
then?
Is that better?
Way
Do-
better.
Do you think that back then the the polite kiss or whatnot would have been seen as unchaste?
Yes.
Yes.
Because
Oh. Well, I'm not interrupting. I'm
you
interested.
didn't. I think that back. I mean, I guess I could check, but I think back then it was you kissed if you were engaged.
Okay. Gotcha.
That's it.
Right.
You didn't kiss. You didn't kiss if you were just dating and maybe
Yeah.
gonna get engaged. You kissed after you got engaged, and then you got married 2 weeks
Fair
later with 2 witnesses. That was it.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think it was Quincy Morris that asked for the consolation kiss. Maybe.
He's very American.
Maybe
What can I say?
Americans were. Yeah, okay. Anyways, so the one that she ends up saying yes. Thank you very much, Will. The one that she ends up saying yes to is Arthur, later to be Lord Goldwing, once his father dies and he inherits the estate. Lucy says, again, just kind of fawning over the guys, "Why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them?" It's like, okay.
Right. and then
She's
yeah.
very dramatic.
She is.
Yeah.
She is.
Well,
Yeah.
she's a caricature, right? She's like a means
Ooh.
to an end of
Yeah.
the story.
Oof.
A little bit.
I mean, it's yeah.
a little.
Yeah,
I like
okay.
her fine, but
Oh, sure.
she was more of a companion to Mina,
Yep.
and then
right.
a bit of a plot device.
An image of what is
An
at
image
risk.
of right
with
of what's gonna of what
later.
might happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Fair enough.
And what they're fighting against.
But we are spoiling
We
a
are
lot
spoiling,
already.
yeah, sorry.
Yes. So they're just talking about Lucy's getting to meet Arthur and get engaged to him, and it introduces 2 other male characters: Quincy Morris, who is a Texan, and Dr. What is his name? John
Seward. Who, by the way, I think is Bram Stoker.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that he's one of the primary authors in the book,
Right.
but I think that he is the one who struggles through the whole book because he's a doctor of psychology of all things.
Sure.
Putting together superstition and science.
Yeah.
And so I think he's a representation of Bram Stoker's journey through writing this book.
Interesting. Psychology was very new at this point. Freud wasn't mainstream at all yet, and William James, who kind of predates Freud, I think, had just barely published his work within 20 or 30 years, I think.
Interesting.
So it was very new, burgeoning science. There was probably a lot of hope around it, like, oh, we can finally figure all this out, but also lots of, lobotomies and, or even just figurative lobotomies, like things that they thought worked that probably didn't.
Yeah.
Like cocaine.
Then there's that. What did you
Radon.
Great. Did you guys get anything out of the conversations that Lucy and Mina had with the old guys?
Oh, up at the churchyard.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was so long ago. I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah. So, Mr. Swales is the 100-year-old one, and he's basically talking about how all of the graves are complete lies. Like the bodies aren't even there necessarily. The ones that are there, they say, "Oh, may God hold their souls and let them rest in peace." And it's like, I knew that guy when he was alive. He said he wanted to go to hell to avoid his mother.
Yeah.
And
I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed the represent. I mean, if you've ever been to a fraternity bar, like an Oaks Lodge,
sure,
like that was basically. It was like girls weren't allowed in there, so that's how they got it. You know, like that was.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I think it was just to kind of almost break the illusion of the girls, because like something had to kind of like kick them into gear almost, and it kind of broke that like, oh, everything's just flowers and getting married and such, and then it's like these old guys are telling them actually how it is and how these people like they're clutching their pearls because this man hated his mother so much he wanted to go to hell kind of thing.
Right.
And it's like it, and then that guy shows his soft side and is like, I didn't mean to scare you, that's how I talk or whatever, and it just kind of shows like that different sides of coins, and then he actually dies, and shows them like he was here yesterday and now he's not here sitting on this bench, we're sitting on this bench and he's under the ground, like, and it kind of breaks their like flowers and rainbows.
Yeah, their very last conversation, it was Lucy wasn't there, it was Mina. And Mr. Swales. Basically, the last thing he does is he points at the storm that we later find out has Dracula's boat, and it said, "Oh boy, there's death. Here it comes." Probably, right? And then he was almost certainly killed by Dracula, right? Like the way.
I don't know. I don't think it matters, right? He just died.
He died.
Right? Death came, and then he accepted it.
Yeah, I think whether or not Dracula killed him or he died of fright, right? His heart gave out. Because wasn't he?
He was
found right there on the bench. He's like, ah,
right.
Yeah.
Like he saw,
right.
Like he saw what?
Right.
I don't know.
Sure.
We were about to find out that Dracula frequents that area. So I don't know. But that brings us to the boat. Tell us about the boat.
Oh man, the boat is the greatest part of the book. The boat is terrifying. So Dracula puts all of his 50 boxes on a boat full of the earth from his castle, and basically this boat rushes in, and the story's being told to us from a news report about a perfect day turning into a storm and a boat rushing at full speed to the shore. And the boat arrives, and the only thing on the boat is the captain clutching a crucifix with his hands tied to the wheel, and a dog that jumps off. And they read through the ship's log, and it's just it's the greatest. Like, that to me was really terrifying. I mean, it was really scary. Like, even though you knew the end already, kind of like this whole book. They start out on the ship, and there's some lovely sort of ethnic dialogue between the Russians and the Romanians, and people just keep disappearing off the ship.
One by one.
One by one.
What's happening to
them? Well, it's not. We're not sure. We assume they're being eaten or consumed by Dracula in some way, but that wouldn't really show that their bodies were going missing. And it's shown by the end that they're killing themselves. They're throwing themselves overboard rather than be eaten by him. Which is even more intense. When you're assuming that he's killing them, and then you're realizing that they're so afraid of him that they would rather throw themselves over, is really something else. You know, it's like the girls up in the Triangle Factory. They'd rather die from the fall than die from the fire.
Jeez.
And so they arrive And we find out all this in this terrifying image. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing really to read into it. It was just scary.
The Mist. What we did? Oh yeah,
Not
sure.
really, no.
A little bit. So so like the Count brings Count Dracula is able to bring storms and the mist and rains and stuff. Again, that's another opposite of Christ sort of thing, who calms the storms.
Right.
Dracula brings the storms. But in addition, in the log of the Demeter, when Dracula is seen, he's described as it or him, both with capital.
Oh, is he?
Oh yeah.
I listened
capital
to it,
letters.
so I didn't get to see that.
Interesting.
Yeah. So and of course Renfield does that too. We haven't talked about Renfield. Who is Renfield?
Psych patient at the doctor's loony bin, for
Right.
lack of a better word.
Asylum.
Asylum. Who?
Which is just in a house, by the way.
Yeah, it's like in Dr. Seward's house.
Yeah.
Which is like in the basement or something. I don't know.
It's a cage. It's fine. He is a patient, and he is odd in different ways because he's always catching flies and then eating them, or catching flies and feeding them to spiders and then eating the spiders, and he seems to want to eat smaller things to take their life for his own.
Yeah. Yeah. Seward notes, what he desires is to absorb as many lives as he can, and he has laid himself out to achieve it in a cumulative way. As you said, he catches the flies and feeds them to the spiders, and he gets the spiders, he feeds them to the birds. He asks for a cat, so to feed the birds to, but he doesn't get it.
Yeah.
And failing that, he just eats the birds raw and throws them up later.
Yeah.
Jumping ahead a little bit, but Renfield doesn't, in that way, doesn't affect the plot, so we're not spoiling anything, really. Once, he does have interactions with Dracula, though, and is affected by him a lot, and we'll talk about that now as we get into the next section, which is Lucy's sleepwalking, her illness, and, well, her fate, we'll say. Mina briefly talks about the new women writers. Did you notice that, and what did you think?
I did. I think it was just like a take on how she was, basically existing to help her husband and be wife, and was she referencing the other, like the journalists and stuff like that, the other women?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It seems to. I mean, she describes the new women as somebody who in the future will not condescend to accept a proposal, but will do the proposing herself.
Talk about feminists.
It's a
Yeah,
proto-feminism
I would say
thing, I
feminism.
think.
I don't know if she was talking. I don't know if she was speaking bad of them, or
No,
if she was
oh
saying.
no, she was admiring them.
Yeah, I don't think she was. Yeah.
Well, she was clearly saying that she wasn't one, and that she was going to try to take aspects of them.
But instead of just being a housewife, I think she wanted
Right.
to learn shorthand so that she could help with this and that, and she wanted to be very involved in his career because she couldn't have her own, assuming. And she wanted to be helpful in other ways besides just homemaker. And she was probably just commenting that other women would be able to do that without even being married at some point.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're right. It's a more interesting conversation that we can't have necessarily right here about the post. This is just post-industrial revolution.
Pretty much.
Right. So we have late Victorian era England, where now you have this break in the household, right? Where now a lot of the things that you needed to do all of the time inside your house that were traditionally done by the wife are now done by a factory.
Right.
And you have work, so the man can go out to work and the woman can stay at home. To do what? I don't know. To be Lucy, I guess. Right? So in the wake of that, you have this idea that women can do something other than be Lucy and be pretty. And this is, I just find it interesting. This is the first sort of one of the earlier rumblings in fiction of that notion.
Definitely.
Right? Because, if this were written 100 years before that, she wouldn't be home saying, oh, I can learn to be a stenographer. She'd be like, I have to do the garden and can, or else we're not going to eat this winter.
Right.
Right? But that's gone by now. That's
Yeah.
gone. They have plenty of big farms. They don't have the modern farms we have today, but they have plenty of big farms, and they have food in the store.
Sure. Yeah, so you have Lucy on one end of the spectrum, Mina probably in the middle, and then the other end is something that doesn't really exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say
It's
that.
not. It's not represented at least.
No.
No.
it's not. But okay. Anyways, in this section, Lucy begins sleepwalking a lot. Mina tries her best to keep her in the house. She can't ultimately, and she finds Lucy out on the bench in the graveyard overlooking the water where they found Mr. Swales, and she sees someone with red eyes was with her, but then he disappears as she turns the corner. That ends up being Dracula, of course. But after that, we infer that Dracula makes multiple visits to Lucy just in her room after that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, disguised as a bat, almost certainly. I don't know why he didn't also, suck Mina's blood while he was in the room, or how he even was allowed to go in.
I don't
in the
think it was
house.
clear that he went in the house.
I don't
No,
think he did. He
she
was flapping at the window, and she just kept coming
She
out.
kept meeting him at the
She kept
window.
coming out.
Meeting him out the
Oh,
window and then coming
Okay,
out.
I missed that.
Because he was never allowed in.
He was never
He was
allowed in.
uninvited.
Okay.
Right, which is to sort of at the end of this section,
Right.
he had to use another means to break in.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Okay.
And it was so important why the window was supposed to be shut, and
Yeah.
then the mother opened it.
Yeah. Anyways.
Also, she wasn't in the same room as her. I think she was in the room adjacent to her for a while, and then she moved into the same room as her.
Mina and Lucy.
They
Okay.
definitely were in the same room after this.
It was after
After
the sleepwalking.
sleepwalking.
After the
I don't-
sleepwalking, right? Yeah. But okay. But anyways, so Dracula starts taking her blood pretty regularly, and she starts to get weaker and weaker with no apparent cause. So she calls in Dr. Seward to come and take a look at her. He's flummoxed, so he calls in Van Helsing, who's a Dutch doctor, philosopher, and metaphysician.
Mina has to leave.
What was it?
Mina has to
Mina
leave.
And
has to
Mina-
leave.
Why?
Because Jonathan's alive!
Yeah, they found him. I think Budapest, something like that.
I don't remember.
Yeah, the
Some
letter.
nuns were
A
helping.
nun, yeah.
Yeah. The letter from the sister came from Budapest, I think.
Mm.
It might have been Germany by the time she got there. I don't know if they moved him or something, but so Mina leaves, and Lucy's all by herself with Seward and then Van Helsing, who are trying to figure out what is wrong with her. But in the meantime, she's got no blood in her. She's dying, so they have to do blood transfusions, and they start with Arthur, her fiance, who just happens to be in the neighborhood. And there's a couple of things, a couple of lines following that I found that I thought were, not super related, but kind of cool. After Lucy receives Arthur's blood, she says, "Somehow Arthur feels very, very close to me. I seem to feel his presence warm about me." And all I could think of was the Eucharist.
Sure. Presence.
Yeah. And then, kind of on the flip side, Dr. Seward says, "No man knows till he experiences it what it is to feel his own lifeblood drawn away into the veins of the woman he loves." That's Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really poetic way. It's funny because as someone who gives blood regularly, it's a very romantic way of talking about it. Like it's like, it gets very, I thought it was a great section. I knew what they were doing, and I was able to separate it in my head, but boy, was I worried about their blood types.
Yeah.
But I think it's a fairly new, I didn't look this up, but I'm pretty sure that the idea of a blood transfusion is fairly new at this point. Right,
Okay.
and I only infer that because Dr. Seward, they have to do it a couple times, and Dr. Seward complains about how ghastly the procedure is.
Yeah.
Right, like this is not, and I know he's not a real doctor, but that to me told me that it was new. Right, this wasn't something doctors were used to doing yet, but the expert who he called in was familiar with it.
Sure. Right. The expert being Van Helsing.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, over the course of trying to keep Lucy alive, Van Helsing gives his blood, Arthur gives his blood, Dr. Seward, and Quincey comes back and he gives his blood too. So, she takes the blood of 4 strong men. Where does it all go? They have no clue. But she does end up dying because, despite Van Helsing's best efforts, now Van Helsing is kind of aware of what's going on with the vampires, with Dracula, but he's not willing to speak about it yet.
Right.
He puts garlic around the windows, around the jamb of the door, it says, reminded of Exodus, of course, the blood of the lamb or something, the way he describes the door.
Sure.
But Dracula breaks in anyway. I don't remember exactly how that worked. Do you guys remember how Dracula broke in?
Oh, so one of the things about Dracula, this is maybe another topic, but that'll get us too far off and we can go back to it at the end, but that sort of the understanding of the powers of Dracula are much greater than they are in typical vampire lore. Quite frankly, because there's too many. Because sort of as we're bearing out, the idea of Dracula and the idea of a vampire to Bram Stoker is much more of a spiritual reality than your average vampire who's just a monster or a disease-ridden individual in a modern movie.
Yeah.
So one of those powers is having control over wolves. He can command them. He can command sort of the dark, eerie, scary things of the night. And he has a wolf break in. He has so he goes to the local zoo and has a wolf break into the house. So they regularly fail at this, right? Because the mother gets involved, and they're trying not to tell the mother that Lucy's really sick because the mother has a bad heart and whatever. So the wolf breaks through the window, causes a heart attack, gives the mom a heart attack, and then it's over for Lucy because the seal's been broken.
Yeah, she's dead within a day. And Arthur, her fiance, is robbed of his last kiss with her because Van Helsing thinks that she's going to bite him because he knows that she's turning into a vampire.
Right.
Which does not happen by the person remaining alive in this because they didn't think of it as a germ. They thought of it as, again, more spiritual. So Lucy has to die first before she becomes a vampire.
Then she's undead.
Right.
She can't be alive. There's 3 separate things. There's dead, there's alive, dead, and undead.
Right. But anyways, once Van Helsing pulls Arthur off of her and says, no, don't you dare kiss her, not for your life or hers. He leaves the room and Lucy says, oh, guard him and give me peace. Basically just before she dies. My question is, do you think that she knew
that
in that moment
what was happening?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do.
I think so because I think she was like fighting with the demon or whatever you want to call it because she was saying come to me, but then once Van Helsing did that, it was like another like rude awakening almost, like take care of him, like because I obviously can't be trusted almost.
Yeah, I don't want to get deep into the weeds of it, but it's almost like there's like it's almost like possession in a way. Like there's her as the vampire who's possesses all the knowledge that Lucy does.
Well, there is a lot of trance-like state things that happen to her. She's into a trance-like state, or like obviously the sleepwalking, that's a trance, and then even when she was awake and they were, helping her, sometimes she was just sitting there staring, like she wasn't able to communicate even.
Right.
Yeah.
She's just a girl.
Goodness. But anyways, so she dies. The funeral's very nice, and at that point is when Van Helsing starts to bring John Seward and the other men into the know about what's going on, and I think that's arguably, at least for me, the most important chapter of the book, chapter 14. He reveals to me what the role of Stoker's novel is in the history of ideas. He says this. You are a clever man, friend John. He's speaking in broken English. You reason well and your wit is bold, but you are too prejudiced. You do not let your eyes see nor your ears hear, and that which is outside your daily life is not of account to you. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand and yet which are, that some people see things that others cannot? But there are things old and new which must not be contemplated by men's eyes, because they know, or think they know, some things which other men have told them. It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all. And if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain. But yet we see around us every day the growth of new beliefs, which think themselves new, and which are yet but the old, which pretend to be young, like fine ladies at the opera. And
that bit about science, that was a quote that I was going to bring up there.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you already read it. Just if it bears repeating, I suppose. It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain.
Right. He likens it to, okay, yeah, we have science. We have this little rock sitting on a railway, right? Are we going to put so much faith in it that it can stop the train coming? You know, basically the whole rest of reality that you can come to know, besides what you can learn by the scientific method. And he says, my thesis is this: I want you to believe, faith, that faculty which enables us to believe things which we know to be untrue. I don't care for that definition, but...
Well, it's not exactly what St. Paul said.
No, but for a scientist, that is the definition.
Yes. I think you're right.
Sure.
Especially at that time. Especially like post-Enlightenment, post-Industrial Revolution.
Anyways, so he convinces John and ultimately Arthur and Quincey as well, yeah, Lucy's become a vampire, we need to go and put her to rest, which means killing her. First they have to set up the tomb. And that's where we have another interaction with the sacred, because Van Helsing has brought not only some golden crucifixes for everybody to hold, which have the similar effect on vampire Lucy as Jonathan's rosary did on Dracula, but he also brings the sacred host, the Eucharist itself, which I have mixed feelings about. I thought it was kind of...
You thought it was a little sacrilegious.
Again, it's kind of a moot point to say, oh, the vampire book doesn't make sense. But
he says he bought it.
No, he had No, he used an indulgence.
Which was the wrong word. So again, Stoker is not a Catholic.
He's not. I feel like it's
Catholic.
clear he's not Catholic, and he just was like, exorcisms use this. Like,
yeah,
it's
like,
fine.
that's
It's nice
kinda
that it's
how
that powerful.
I'm glad he showed
like,
the power of
yes.
it. I'm with you, but it's like, okay, you don't really know what you're talking about. No Catholic would ever do that.
Right. So
yes, it would work.
They're
but
crumbling
you know
it
what
on
else
the
would
ground.
So I don't necessarily. My basic feeling is that if Bram Stoker were raised probably in the town over from what he was born, and he was a Catholic and not part of the Church of Ireland, Van Helsing would have been a priest. Right? Because Van Helsing doesn't have a family. There's a line, I don't know the line in particular,
He's
but
a widower.
what's that?
He's a widower.
He's a widower.
Sort of. His wife is in an insane asylum.
Oh, I thought she was dead.
There's a line where he says, like, my wife is dead to me, but alive by church law. Meaning
I thought
like,
she died.
yeah, I'll have to look it up, but basically he's not free to marry because he's married, but they haven't talked in years.
Interesting.
Yeah, she's completely gone, basically.
Okay, which I think, if I remember correctly, I think that's supposed to sort of explain why he became an expert in. That's his backstory to explain why he became sort of an expert in the idea of psychology and the cult and things like this.
But yeah, let's get back to the
Eucharist.
But
so I think that he would be a priest, right? Because at one point, he's like, I don't have anybody, and I'm old, and I'm lonely, and that's why I throw myself into this important work, right? Which is not to say that all priests are old and lonely, but the point still stands that sort of anybody who has to deal with these things can only do so much when they have a family behind them.
Sure.
And I think that he would have been a priest, right? Because in this scenario, if there was anything close to a possession and you needed an exorcist, a priest would be coming, likely carrying the Eucharist, and then would be using it appropriately. And this is a sort of an approximation of that.
Sure.
And so I like it.
Yeah.
I like it very much.
Okay.
I think it's great.
I'm not offended by it.
Right.
I don't know
Because
if
it's not really
that's how I would
but-
have wrote it, but I'm not offended by it.
Right.
You would have written him as a priest.
Yeah.
We all would have,
Yeah,
right?
I would have written Mina as Doctor. No.
No, that's right. That's right. Sort of an interesting thing.
Anyways. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a tangent that during your reading of his speech and or talking about psychology, I think the idea of science, I don't know. I don't have to tread too lightly, but I don't know if the whole idea of John Seward being a psychologist, obviously that's sort of a structure available to give us the character of Renfield. Mm-hmm. However, the idea of psychology at the time is developed out of the understanding of the mind can be wholly scientific. Mm-hmm. Right, and this is only an idea that came to mind because that's the conversation that we're having, is superstition versus science. And I think the number one criticism that we have today of psychology is that it never includes the soul. Mm. Right, and so I don't know if that was a criticism of the time. That's why those particular choices were made for the book.
I don't know,
but it's just something that came to mind.
Yeah,
I'd bring it up.
Yeah. Well, we'll finish the scene. So the way the host is used is as putty to go around the door, and this prevents Vampire Lucy, who's coming back from sucking the blood out of a child, who survives, I think.
Yes.
They all do.
Yeah. That makes her unable to go back to her tomb, where she has to go before daytime. So that gives all the men the opportunity to see her. They're abhorred by what she's become. And so he takes away a little bit of the putty, and then she's able to kind of phase through the door to get back to her coffin.
Yeah.
And at that point, Van Helsing gives Arthur the stake and hammer and says, okay, go ahead, stake her heart and put her to rest. And they do. Mm-hmm. But we're kind of... sorry, any comments on that?
Yeah, lots of comments.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
On her ending?
On her ending.
Okay.
Yeah. Her ending and the manner of it, and Arthur doing it, whatever you would want to say. After that, where you have to double back to Renfield and Jonathan. So.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think the most... I think one of the things that was refreshing about this book, I'll say sort of two things, is that during this, and particularly the part preceding it, we have really flowery language being used by the men. They're very, very comfortable being very open with one another and being very affectionate with one another and being very friendly with one another. And I just found that refreshing. And the other part of that I found refreshing is how repulsed they were by the vampire. Unlike a lot of modern sort of understandings of vampires, which are beautiful and sexy and attractive for all the reasons that we talked about earlier,
right.
I thought it was really neat that they saw how she was turned into something and it completely repulsed them. I really liked that aspect of the story. I actually asked my brother what he thought before we did this interview, and he said that was his favorite part of the book, was Arthur staking Lucy. He thought that was the most impactful part of the book.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you?
I think that it showed, they portrayed her as like even more beautiful than she was. Like they talked about that, but yet they had like a recoil because they knew that it was wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that Van Helsing is such a like professor that he was like teaching them the whole way and trying to like lead them to like to the point that she was a vampire and all that, and they had to make the decisions on their own, which like
check one thing.
Because for what other reason is he going to allow her to be alive another night and drink the blood of another child?
Sure. Just I think it's interesting because they like Arthur talked about how he had given her the blood and he felt like they were already married, and then they all kind of had to admit to him that they had also given her blood, and I thought that was tragic. And then but they still ultimately gave him like the duty of it, and I think that the theme of like women in Dracula is that Bram Stoker kind of viewed them as like innocents. Like he viewed them, I think most of the victims that they talk about of Dracula are either women or children.
Very disproportionately so.
Yes, and like Renfield, but he was deranged, right?
Yeah.
So I think that most of the time...
And he wasn't, they didn't drink him either.
Right, he just got
he was just a victim, yeah. I think that the women were like just portrayed as like innocents, and At one point, Jonathan says that that Mina is like all perfection. So they're just like this like virtuous thing, and the men were able to take out like they were able to save Lucy. Like they weren't thinking of it as destroying Lucy. They were doing it to save Lucy because Lucy was trapped by this evil, which was voluptuous and still trying to kiss him and all those things. And instead of them feeling like we have to kill this monster, it was we have to save Lucy from the monster that she had become. So I think that gave them like more like courage and manliness to still be like saving the damsel almost. So I thought that was interesting the way that was written. Even they were stabbing her and cutting her head off, like like literally. And I think, but they were doing it like to save her and her goodness.
Right.
Do you know how I imagine it? Is have you ever seen Coraline?
No.
It's pretty good.
Okay.
It's been very popular this year. It was re-released and it's made like
Okay.
I don't know, $50 or $60 million, even though it's a 15-year-old movie. So you remember in Coraline the other mother, and the way that she turns from looking like Coraline's mother into what she actually looks like. That's how I imagine Lucy, right? Like she's angular. She's you take what are sort of traditional attractive traits of high cheekbones, and now you give them sharp cheekbones, right? And you give somebody like
unnatural
nice teeth, and then you give them long teeth,
pointed,
right? Or I imagine her as like, imagine your perfect magazine model, and then cut in and made sharper. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, like physically sharper. Like her hips are sharper, her teeth are sharper, her features are sharper.
Right.
And the image that came to mind was the other mother, which they might know.
Huh. Probably. All right. Gotta double back a little bit because Renfield has a number of reactions to Dracula's proximity or lack thereof. Multiple times he runs out to next door, which is where Dracula ends up living, but they don't know that yet. And he says things like, "I am here to do your bidding, master. I am your slave, and you will reward me, for I shall be faithful. I await your commands, and you will not pass me by. Will you, dear master, in your distribution of good things?" Every single reference to Dracula in that sentence has a capital.
Okay.
Interesting.
Your, master, etc. Definitely messianic language. But then, oddly enough, Dr. Seward, hearing this, makes a similarly biblical comment and says, he thinks of the loaves and fishes even when he believes he's in a real presence. Commenting on how Renfield is,
What are you going to give me?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in all fairness, I think that's as far as Dracula, in the best of possibilities, would have done for him too. I think he's, and we go over this later. Look, he's inherently selfish. Yeah.
I think that this was one of my favorite parts because Dr. Seward sort of consistently showed that he was not an atheist. He references the Bible. He has this understanding of spirituality, at least academically.
Sure.
Which I thought was really neat.
A little bit more typical for the time, I think.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah.
You never know.
You never know.
Yeah.
It's true.
I think it's really neat whenever he interacts with Renfield because you see him being like, he applies the scientific method to how he deals with him. He's like, I gave him flies and he reacted this way. I didn't give him flies and he reacted that way. And he repeats that throughout his interactions with him, which seems kind of cruel, but
a little.
He
talks about that too. He's like, gee, why am I doing this?
Yeah, he's like, I don't mean to be cruel, but like he's really a madman and I need to understand him so that I can help him. So at least it shows his virtue.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned that Dr. Seward uses the scientific method when dealing with Renfield. I feel like even in the midst of acknowledging the existence of spiritual or at least superstitious realities, even Van Helsing's method is oddly scientific as well. like the different days of Lucy's illness. He says, okay, we'll put garlic on the windows. Let's see if that works. Okay, we'll do blood transfusions. We'll see if that works. His approach is scientific. It's just applied to different materia.
Well, I think he's performing that Sherlock Holmes squib. He's ruling out every possibility.
But he's also using that knowledge, and he's like he said, like he knows that garlic might sway it, even though it's not scientific that it would be, because nobody else knows what they're swaying, right?
There's no
so
textbook
he's
on
using
vampires.
scientific knowledge but he's just adding in the lore / the superstitions as the facts, because that's what he's like concluding that it's both.
He kind of unites both methods of thinking.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
He's very quotable. He's a very quotable character.
Yeah. Which is remarkable in an English novel for a character that speaks broken English. Yeah, but
that's true.
Also, in the process of this, Van Helsing speaks to Jonathan and confirms for him, no, you're not crazy. What you saw was real. And Jonathan, in this, I think is something of a representative of man at this time. What do you do if all you can really trust is what can be empirically proven? And for intellectuals like Bram Stoker, it was beyond that. David Hume's ideas, which were things like you can't even trust your senses, those would have been well known too.
Right.
Where does that put you? It puts you in despair, in doubt, just like Jonathan. And it takes someone, in this case Van Helsing, to come in and say, no, you can't trust your senses. What you did see was real. There are other ways of knowing besides the scientific method, empiricism. And that's all it took to snap him out of basically being a nervous wreck into...
Well, he was having physical manifestations of his stress,
Yeah.
and then they stopped, and he even said, if I wouldn't have got that confirmation, I would have just slowly descended into madness.
Yeah,
Right.
Right. So, anyways, yeah, chapter 14, definitely, I think, the most important chapter of the book in terms of that.
Yeah, as far as explaining the purpose philosophically of what the book is doing.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, did Stoker succeed? That's a different question. He's writing a novel, not a treatise, you know?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
But anyways.
Maybe if you're English, but
yeah, sure.
I'll never admit it.
Yeah. Then we move on to all the characters coming together, and they say, hey, let's put all of our notes and diaries entries in order. And that's this book, I suppose.
Yeah. I texted you. I go, wow, this book's getting a little bit too meta for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like I've heard that a criticism of Dracula is that the first 5 chapters are really scary, and the end of the book is really exciting. And like many sort of books of the time, the middle is boring. I didn't find sort of the communication between the girls boring. I thought it was neat to learn all the characters and understand all their caricatures. And then we get to this point where they're all in the same room together, and they're like, wow, we're all in the same room together. Maybe we should talk for like, 2 chapters?
Something like that.
It's like a long time, and it felt. I was like, dude, this is way too meta for me. And you're like, what does that mean? Good question. And I was like, the team up. I don't know if it's that there's like every other movie that comes out today is like a Misfit team up, so I'm just over it, or what? But their Misfit team up energy was too high.
Yeah,
it was too much for me.
Well, part of it.
I loved that they got together, but the idea that they were talking about it for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, part of it was to develop Mina's character again, because she was, supporting actress, but then all of a sudden when they all got together, like she was the only reason that Jonathan came out of it, right? She was the one that talked with Van Helsing. She then broke her promise to her husband, opened up the journal, told Van Helsing about it, even though she was like not wanting to do that. She felt like she had to. Yeah. She's the one that did that. She put all the pieces together, and then once the band got together, she was the one that her and Jonathan went in the room, and she listened to all of the phonograph ones. She typed them all out. She organized it all and made the timeline. So it was really just showing how crucial she was, and how she wasn't just a damsel. She wasn't just a woman. They said, she has the brain of a man, but the empathy of a woman, or whatever.
How did you feel about that particular line?
I thought that I was not gonna like it, because I was like, that's so typical. Like this, she's the only girl left, right? She's the only girl in the whole in the whole book now, and like they're like making her more like a man, but then they basically just showed how the feminine aspect of it like helped them all through it, right? Quincy was so manly and so American and whatever, but then as soon as Mina was like, "You good?" He was like, "No," and just started crying on her shoulder, even though it was totally uncouth to do that. She's a married woman.
Sure.
And then the same thing with Arthur. I loved her, and she was able to empathize because she loved Lucy as much as he did, right? Like,
right.
So it just showed how like the feminine side of her was, like we're talking about, like the facts and the spiritual aspect. Like she wasn't as strong as them. She wasn't, but her empathy and femininity was like more important and as important as how strong they were and how smart they were. She didn't have she wasn't a doctor or anything like that, but if she wasn't there, none of that, they all would have just lost it. Like they couldn't have caught him if she wasn't there to make the timeline and be empathetic, basically.
Right, so that line from Van Helsing about having a man's brain but the empathy of a woman initially seems like it's negative, but it turns out to be very positive.
Right.
Turns out
because she
she's
just
gotten
had
the best.
She had more.
She has the
right?
best.
She was better than them, right? Because she was able to help them all in different ways. Maybe not better, but she was able to be organized and thoughtful like them, but also had like the more typical feminine qualities of empathy
and she doesn't have all that. She doesn't have all that strict, hardened reason downloaded onto her that, let's say, that like Dr. Seward does. Mm-hmm. The quote that you were referencing was, "No one but a woman can help a man when he is in trouble of the heart," which I thought was great.
Yeah.
Which she shows in all of the men.
Correct.
Every single one of them have a moment like that where they couldn't have got through, Jonathan's fits of whatever, being crazy from his trauma, and then Quincy and all of them go through it, and all through Mina.
Yeah, and that is the purpose of what they're doing, the purpose of compiling all the records. They're trying to figure out, okay, Dracula did this. Where is he now? Can we stop him? Mm-hmm. And despite all that Mina does, despite all the men's overwhelming admiration of her, they decide, we are men and we're able to bear, but we're gonna keep you out of our future conversations and just not talk to you about anything going on.
Yeah,
and,
cut her off.
Chapter 19.
Completely cut her off.
Are we on chapter 19?
Yes.
We are.
About
Also, Quincy Morris has an American moment where he tries to shoot the bat and breaks a window in the process. I felt well represented. But okay, so chapter 19 is when they're not talking to each other at all, and therefore nobody is noticing what's going on. Sadie, do you have some feelings about this chapter?
It was the worst chapter for me, for the characters and the writing.
What was going on?
Basically it was just boys club, and they go to hunt the vampire next door. They figure out that he's next door. Mm-hmm. And they say, "Mina, you're too fragile. We'll just leave you home and you can sleep." And she doesn't sleep. And they go, and Dracula gets to Mina. Mm-hmm. And they don't really figure it out until it's too late.
I think that's the crux of the criticism right there, is that like there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't have been able to see it.
Yeah.
Sure.
They just saw Lucy. She was having all the same symptoms. She was anemic. She was weak. She was sleeping all the time.
Right. Mina's sleeping until 1 in the afternoon, and they're like,
she's
so
pale.
tired from the stress, and she's so pale. Every single time they described her, they're like, she's even paler. She's even paler. I'm like,
and he goes to great lengths to write it down per character, like 3 times.
Right.
So it really is like I think you could view, if you wanted to, you could view it as sort of like a feminist thing. Mm-hmm. I just view it as like he got to this moment and realized he didn't know what he was going to do with the plot, right? Like that chapter 19 is because plot to me.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Van Helsing was reading through all the notes trying to find the plot.
Right. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
exactly.
But anyways, eventually they do come up across Dracula. Renfield had tried to warn them, say, "Hey, get me out of this building, or basically I'm gonna invite Dracula."
He's begging
But he
them.
doesn't say that because he's bound. He can't say it.
Right, because
He's not gonna transfer.
his moments of sanity are almost his moments of not being bound to Dracula.
Right. But he's still forbidden to talk about certain things. He asks John, "Please take me out of the asylum." And when Seward refuses, he's like, "Well, they'll say I didn't warn you." And sure enough, he gives Dracula permission to enter, to come and go as he pleases. That's how he gets access to Mina. And one day, all the men come into the bedroom and catch him in the act. But he wasn't just sucking her blood this time. I wasn't expecting this. Stoker completely flips the script and has Dracula give Mina his vampire blood to drink, which I was like, okay, what does that do? And basically it causes the change to vampirism while the person is still alive. So Mina's now actively changing day by day, even though he hasn't killed her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's taking time off.
That, I admit, was an important detail for me because when I was confused because Lucy needed to die first and then Mina didn't, but I didn't realize that until later.
Sure, right. Let's see, Van Helsing calls it a
Vampire baptism.
Vampire baptism. That's right. Of course, obvious perversion in the language there. In the process of this, Renfield is killed because he has some admiration for Mina, and so he tries to beat up Dracula. Fails, of course. Dracula kills him.
Well, calling back to Renfield and him wanting the loaves and the fishes, Dracula literally sent rats to him to like satiate him and say like, here, if you'll do my bidding, I'll send you like thousands of rats to his place. And he looked like Drac's such a narcissist that he was like, this is what's gonna get him. And it's literally rats, like it's the scum of the earth. And just the fact that he was like, I can get this dude to do my bidding just on rats. And then Renfield does have moments of clarity, and in those moments of clarity, he's also still wanting to save Mina. Like, Mina is now all virtue in this whole book at the end of it. Like, she's the only reason for these guys continuing their quest, just like Lucy was saving Lucy and saving Mina.
Over her.
They're all just like, oh, Mina, you know, and even Renfield, who's crazy and not even part of the Scooby Gang, like, they're like he's just like, I have to save Mina, so he tries, and you know, his end is because of that.
I think the two aspects that I really like about the book in general that you're hitting on again is that Dracula shows up and he goes, I will give you all of these rats if you'll bow down and worship me.
Yeah.
Right, which is what the devil says to Jesus.
Right.
And like you pointed out, it's rats. And the interesting part about that, as opposed to a lot of modern vampire things, is like there's nothing attractive about this. There's nothing attractive at all. It's total evil. It's total depravity.
Yep.
To steal one of his terms. And so I really like that. And like you had said, Mina's innocence has to be preserved. And and that's the moment of clarity that he had. He has to break out. And it's actually one of our favorite lines of the book comes from that moment, which I wrote down in my journal here, which is, I had heard that madman had unnatural strength. And as I knew I was a madman, at times anyhow, I resolved to use my power. Which is just a fantastic line.
Very good line.
Fantastic
and he wanted
line.
to use it to save Mina. That was what
Definitely.
his end goal ended up being too.
Yeah, and of course the vampire was going to overpower him, but it wasn't a contest of strength. He just demoralized him with his eyes.
Yeah.
You know, he's like caught sight of him and is like, oh, okay, I'm not fighting you anymore.
Yeah.
So.
Well, he just grabbed him, break the back of his skull.
Well, I mean, yeah, there was that, but first. Before that.
It's gory.
Yeah. Okay, so at that point, Mina is now sensitive to sacred objects. At one point, Van Helsing touches the host to her, but it burns her, leaves a scar that stays.
A red mark on her forehead.
Red mark on her forehead.
That
Mark of
reminds
Cain.
people. Right, the mark of Cain. and it
Okay.
right, and it reminds in moments of hope and stuff, she'll look in the mirror and it reminded that she's not pure anymore, or they'll be in moments of hope and then they look at her and remember what it's all about and not to be too hopeful, that they need to just keep trudging forward.
Yeah. Van Helsing warns her, don't kill yourself, don't out of fear of becoming a vampire. It's most important that you don't die right now. And it reminded me of mortal sin. Because I mean once you're in mortal sin, the most important thing is that you stay alive long enough to get to confession. Right? And that's kind of the state that she's in. It's like, okay, you're very fragile right now, just stay away from...
She calls herself, she basically acts like she's like a creature now. Like she like doesn't want anyone to touch her, and like people have said that before you get baptized, you're like creature versus child or something like that. I've heard that before. And it's kind of like similar to that, how she basically like recoils from everyone because she's like, I'm not pure. Like she was all pureness and all perfection, as her husband says, and then she's reminded because of a spot on her forehead that she's like tainted.
Where she throws herself on the ground and screams, unclean.
Unclean,
Yeah.
Which is super intense.
Absolutely.
It also adds, just as a
please
for the plot, right? It adds a level of expediency, right? Of urgency. Thank you.
Yep.
For the rest of the book.
Yeah.
And I feel like the first 5 chapters I read all in one. It kind of meandered through like 6 through 19, and then I read 19 through 27 basically in 1 or 2 sittings.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't put it down.
At that point, same. Yeah. Jonathan's hair turns white. I just want to say that his hair turns white when he finds out what happened to Mina. It's very strange, but I think it has significance, but not now. I just want to put it on the record. And so, anyways, they all say, well, Mina, you've been got. You stay in the house, and we're gonna go hunt down Dracula.
She's out of the game again.
Yeah, out of the game again. And they go and find almost all of the boxes and make all of Dracula's boxes of earth, his coffins, where he has to rest, and they sanctify them, make sure that he can't come back to them. And then they actually encounter him briefly, and they almost corner him, and but he gets away and shouts back at them.
You didn't hide your wives. You're gonna outsmart me. I've lived through hundreds of generations, right? I've lived through hundreds of generations.
Right.
I've taken over entire countries.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never outsmart me. And you know why? Because I've already gotten your own girls. They're mine now.
But anyways, it turns out that his last box was hidden on a ship as a last resort for an escape. And now we kind of go to the last part of the book that to me kind of goes very, very fast. But Van Helsing has a monologue where he's talking about Dracula's child brain working, and also his there's a sort of connected. He's talking about him going back to his old habits in the way that criminals do. Do you have something to say about that? You pointed.
I'm just a true crime nerd,
okay.
And the way that my sister and I specifically just talk about true crime all the time, and we do the podcasts and study the different serial killers or just like well-known criminals, and the way that we always describe them, like we're very derogatory in like we just make fun of them because they're just so stupid, right? And like I felt that way almost when he kept saying, "Oh, child brain," like he's such a like a bumblebutt, like you know what I mean? Like he's able to pull everything off because he's been doing it for so long,
right.
But his child brain makes him so like predictable almost because he's so like to his own self, which is a very like Satanism thing. Like in like the occult, if you're a Satanist, you're to your own will. The only your only compass is to your own self.
Sure.
So
ye shall be as gods.
Right, you make yourself your own god, which is what I felt like he was doing the whole time. Like it doesn't matter what's happening around you. It doesn't matter what might happen later as a snowball effect from your action, but what you want to do, you're gonna do it, and that's how Satanism as like a modern term is like to your own will is their like slogan basically. Like you do things to your own will, and it's just if you want to do it, that's what you do.
Right, and to speak to the true crime, he's predictable because he does the same thing, right? Like most serial killers kill people in the same way.
Right, like modus operandi. Right.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of the last phase of the book. They figure he's going back to Transylvania, and they are watching the train schedules. They're watching the boat telegrams come in as the ship he's on passes various points, and they're trying to wait for the right time to overtake him during the day while he's in his coffin, so that they can stake him. And that entire time, Mina has a sort of mental connection to him, on account of the baptism, I suppose, that lets her know, like kind of feel and hear and see through his senses at sunrise and sunset, provided Van Helsing is hypnotizing her. So that kind of gives them a little bit to go off of as they're chasing him. And I don't know that there's much to talk about for the most of the chase, except that Jonathan says a lot of things, such as, if we find out that Mina must be a vampire in the end, then she shall not go into that unknown and terrible land alone. I suppose it is thus that one vampire meant many in the old days. So the holiest love was the recruiting sergeant for their ghastly ranks. He says that, but in addition he says, if beyond it I could send his soul forever and ever to burning hell, talking about Dracula, I would do it. I just kind of want that on the record, but Jonathan's kind of, like, he's willing to become a vampire. If it means not leaving Mina alone. Let's consider that for a second. And then also, he wants to send Dracula to hell if possible.
Yeah, and I think that's another device to show how virtuous Mina is, because she basically reprimands him every time. So like that.
It's true, he does. Well,
and it's also understandable, right?
The becoming a vampire one, that one was private, so she never heard that. But yes. Yeah.
Well, her full name is Wilhelmina, and I looked up like what that means because I had a feeling that he had picked that name specifically. And the first part of it, Will, is desire, obviously, and then the last part of it is helm. So like more like a golden helmet. So basically, her name Wilhelmina means they want to protect her. Like it's the desire to protect her, the desire, or maybe the protection, because she's with gilded helmet is the old English of it, and then the medieval was like strength, bravery, nobility, and then Mina, just Mina in Old German means love, which Van Helsing's German, right?
Right.
So
no, he's Dutch.
Oh, Dutch. Okay. Well, he sounded German in the audiobook. But you know, I just thought that was interesting because it just shows how like they just want to protect her, even if that means if he wants to send Dracula to hell, but he's also willing to become a vampire, he's like he's gonna martyr all of them, right? He's gonna.
Sure.
I assume that was what his intention would be. He doesn't want Mina to be alone because he wants to protect her and and then he also wants to kill Dracula. So
I mean, he was just seeing red.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You basically saw red to me the other day when I texted you a meme about how your wife was a nerd, and you told me to meet you out at the playground. So you told me.
No. I distinctly said behind the school.
Okay.
Yeah. Moving along, they do get closer and closer to Dracula's castle, but they split up, and we have I thought the most chilling part of the book was Mina and Van Helsing, because they're a crew. They go together. Yeah. Their trip to the castle, where Mina's sleeping more and more and more during the daytime, and she's just awake and just kind of staring at night. That was the creepiest part to me. Van Helsing knows what's going on, but he's too afraid to,
right.
He's just terrified.
And he makes a circle again of the host.
Right.
And
so she can't
get out.
He loves her though.
Yeah.
Like
he
wants
does.
to protect her, but he has to also protect himself.
Right. And it's at that point that the wives of Dracula show up, and they say, "Oh, our sister, come join us." And she can't because she's in the circle.
Yeah.
But that's where you also get that dichotomy that you were talking about, the direct comparison. Yeah, she's nothing like them, not really.
But he was protecting her in putting her in a circle, basically. Right. He was protecting her from herself, not so much, but she hasn't spilled any blood. Lucy actually spilled blood, but Mina never did. Yeah. So he was protecting her from going over to be with them, or they were, tinkling of bells, basically, like a fairy, like saying, "Come with us, come on, it's fun, whatever, come to the castle." And she's just in the dark, surrounded by a force where she can't move. She's trapped, but he was protecting her from spilling blood, which would have been his own, but also like she was still pure, even though she had the mark on her forehead, and she hadn't spilled any blood.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The poetic justice, I think, of them, for Jonathan at least, of having to return to Castle Dracula, was. I enjoyed that very much. I enjoyed this chase where they split into groups, and I really enjoyed how they wrapped it up.
Right. Speaking of that, let's talk about that. So they all come together. It's daytime, but getting towards evening. It's the gypsies who are carrying the coffin towards the castle, and they all surround them. Van Helsing and Mina stand off, but the four others are. Surround them. They've got guns. They've got knives, and they say, step away, give them up. And the gypsies decide, no.
Van Helsing and Mina had guns too. They were just up on a hill.
Right. They were just up on a hill, standing back. And the gypsies say, no, we're gonna fight. And so there's a fight. Quincey and Jonathan with Quincey with a Bowie knife because he's an American, and Jonathan with a kukri knife. If you don't know what that looks like, I'll put a picture up. They slash their way onto the coffin, onto the cart, and then they stab him from there. In the process, Quincey is mortally injured, and first of all, they stab Dracula. Jonathan stabs him in the throat, and Quincey stabs him in the heart. And so he dies. He's gone. The gypsies all run away. And Quincey dies of his injuries, and we get to see Mina's forehead finally clear. She is free of the influence of the vampire. Let's talk about that ending.
Right, and he turns into dust, too.
Right, yeah.
Because his body was returned to the time. It was hundreds of years old. It would have decomposed by then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think so even though this story was told through journals, I legitimately didn't know who was going to live and who was going to die up to the end. I didn't know that Mina wasn't going to turn into a vampire. Mm-hmm. Even at one point in my reading, for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe at the end of this, Jonathan will be the vampire, because I think I just have a very cynical view from having watched very cynical tales.
Yeah.
I think one of the criticisms of the last generation of film is that it's all very ironic and cynical, and it's not usually very sincere. And so I was like, I really didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't want to let myself believe that they could win. And then when they did win, right, Van Helsing goes and he gets rid of he releases and kills the wives, and then Jonathan jumps up on the cart and pulls the box off, which normally takes more than one man by himself. He pulls that box off by himself out of his pure adrenaline, and they get rid of Dracula. I think it was very exciting to me. It was a very exciting moment. I thought it was written very well. I think I had made the criticism that Quincey was an unnecessary character in this book. My wife sort of fought me on that the whole time.
I did.
I don't know if maybe if we're talking of the America. If we're talking,
exactly.
It's primarily because she's a patriot, and I love her for that, especially in this book of Englishmen. But I think if to talk about the sort of the roles of the sexes, like he was the boring man, right? He was sort of he He was a good, strong man
Mm-hmm.
for 27 chapters. Like, that was it.
Okay.
But you had made a really good point earlier about Quincey. Not in this, but to me, as an aside, that before they go on the journey, pick up, when you want to. Mina makes them all promise that.
Oh yeah.
There you go.
So when they go on, before they decide to split up, before they all try to do the end phase, Mina says, like, if this doesn't work out and you guys don't get him, you can't let me be a vampire. You have to kill me. Like, you have to. Because she was definitely thinking about killing herself before, to save them.
Right, and decided against it because
and decided, Van Helsing was like, don't do that. And she said, in one of her moments, because she was going in and out of being able to even communicate with them, it was basically only like at sunrise and sunset, which I really liked how that framed the last part of the book. It made like sense to me. And she says, like, when she's about to not be able to talk to them again, and they didn't know if they were going to be able to talk to her again basically every time, she says, like, you guys have to do what needs to be done as men. Like, you need to cut my head off and stake me in the heart and make sure I don't become a vampire. And Jonathan's like, no, like, I can't do that. But Quincey was already nodding yes before she even got it out of her mouth. Like, she said, I have something to ask of you, and Quincey said yes. And that was what I was like, he's the American, like, he's the manly, like, I'm gonna have to do what has to be done, even if it's gross, and I don't want to, because he loved her like a sister. He found solace in her empathy and femininity and all of that. And I thought that he was a good character. When Will was saying
there's nothing that he's providing in the story that couldn't be written into the other characters.
He was the one that was like, he was the one that ran outside and started shooting bats. Like, it sounds silly, but like, he was trying to get stuff done. Like, he wasn't trying.
Yeah, right.
He wasn't like messing around.
He was always meant to die at the end.
He had to, because he was it wasn't his wife that was being turned into a vampire, but he still jumped on that coffin or whatever.
Yeah.
He still jumped on the crate to pull it out. If Jonathan hadn't got there 2 seconds before, he would have got there. Like, he still did stab him, and he had to fulfill his quest, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. Quincey was almost a little too eager. He's like, I'll even kill you before you become a vampire, that'll make you feel better.
Yeah.
Which I was like, okay. Well,
sure.
I don't know.
He was gung-ho, but
He was
willing to put his money where his mouth was.
Yeah. I want to talk about Jonathan. I've made a few points about him, and I want you to tell me if this is crazy. This is definitely headcanon territory, but his hair turns white.
Yeah.
At one point, much like Dracula's is when we first meet him. He talks about his willingness to become a vampire himself out of grief and like seeing red for the one that he loves, and then he uses, of all things, a kukri knife to stab Dracula not in the heart like you're supposed to, in the throat. Now, for those of you who don't know, it's halfway folklore, halfway tradition that a kukri knife, traditionally carried by the Gurkhas, the Nepalese warriors, is for two things. It's for blood sacrifices, and it's also when it's unsheathed in anger, it has to taste blood. Basically, it's a blood drinking knife.
Right, and if you unsheathed it and you didn't attack your enemy, you had to cut yourself.
Right,
because it needed blood.
Yeah. So of all knives, that's what Jonathan's holding when he stabs Dracula in the throat. Is it just poetic justice, or with all the other details, are we seeing like, maybe he could have been a vampire.
Right, we're seeing that cynical moment that I had.
Right.
And
maybe he would have been good at it.
He was left alone with the wives, right?
Right.
And we didn't know what happened, and then all of a sudden he was. But he could have been slowly turning, and maybe he's just a dude, not like Lucy. Like, he's just a guy, so he was able to fight it more, and then like he was able to fight it off more.
Yeah,
and blend
Dracula
in.
almost certainly drank his blood. he says at the very beginning, outside the door to the wives, no, tonight's me, the next night's you. And then it's the next day before the wives would have gotten the turn that he escapes.
Right.
And Dracula's youth is restored, there's blood all over his mouth. He's definitely drank someone's blood, but we never hear Jonathan say, oh, gee, what's this? But then again, nobody notices that.
Right.
Mina doesn't, Lucy doesn't notice him. And the next time we see him, he's been in the hospital for a month, so...
Yeah, I don't know. So it's something I didn't bring up earlier because we just don't know what happened in those 6 weeks, right? He's left in the castle with, like you said, with the wives, and the next thing we know, he's in the hospital. When did he get to the hospital? How did he get out of the castle?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And like if he were a vampire with all of the,
which I'm not necessarily saying he is. I'm saying
I'm pretty sure we can say that he can't.
Right.
Be because he did all of these investigations during the day.
Sure.
He was able to touch crucifixes.
He was.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. And so we know that he's not. So I do think it's poetic justice. And maybe you could even go further than saying it's poetic justice. You could probably go further and say that there's something to the idea that, you know, you meet Dracula and his hair is white, and because he's evil, right? And then he drinks blood and he becomes younger, and that's kind of a cool thing, right? Mm-hmm. But Jonathan is seeing red, right? That's a term I've used, not from the book, but he's seeing red, and he's willing to send people to hell and spend eternity as a vampire. Now his hair is white.
Sure.
Right? So even if it's not that he is a vampire, there's an aspect to his spirit that is vampiristic.
I would agree with that. I think that's probably what I'm getting at. But, all right.
The kukri is really an interesting...
Definitely.
Really, I mean, I guess,
yeah.
I believe, you know, India was at the time, because it's from Nepal, right? Nepal's...
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, I gotta look this up before I offend everybody.
Yeah,
it's located between South Asia, China, and India. Okay, right. So
it's
the English were in India at the time. India was a colony of England, so they had fought with the Gurkhas.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Right.
That's where Stoker was lower front, for sure. But yeah, so that's most of what we have to say about Dracula. We've gotten through the whole story, touched on all the different themes. Definitely a flawed novel story-wise, but very, very enjoyable. Started multiple generations of inspiration for the horror genre in film, literature, even video games. And then in the terms of its place on the world stage and the history of ideas, it kind of points to a potential problem with the reductionist scientific model that had kind of taken over philosophy since the time of Bacon. Does anybody else have any final
Before
comments?
we go, do you have a favorite version of, at least on film, of Dracula?
Sesame Street.
What a good answer.
Nosferatu.
Nosferatu.
Yeah, I think...
The silent, yeah.
To me, that's I think Nosferatu's... I imagine Dracula when I was reading the book. I imagined him as Nosferatu.
Okay.
My favorite one, which goes against literally everything that I said that I liked about this book, was definitely the guy who played Dracula in Van Helsing.
Okay, I haven't seen it.
Oh my goodness, this movie's so good. We should watch it.
Alright.
He was attractive and like all the things that I said I didn't like. But the guy was having so much fun in the role. But that's beyond me.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Will, Sadie, thank you so much.
Thank you.